Dankeschön.
Guten Abend, herzlich willkommen, good evening and a warm welcome. First of all to Robert Macfarlane for being here tonight at Stiftung Nantesbuch. Also to everybody out there online, a warm welcome because we're live streaming this event. Thank you for tuning in from wherever you are in the world. And also a very warm welcome and thank you to the British Council and Elke Ritt, who is our prolific partner for this special night. Introducing Robert, as I recently witnessed in Munich, is a tricky business. He is a very attentive listener, and if you do not get your facts straight, he will interrupt. Very kindly, but still, he will interrupt. So how to introduce him then?
Get my birthplace right this time.
I think so. How to introduce him? Well, regurgitating seems to be a perfectly suitable activity for an evening in the countryside. We're surrounded by cattle, but I shall refrain from duplicating biographical facts that you can best find online. A brief tongue-in-cheek intro will have to do.
Now I'm worried.
Robert Macfarlane was born in the old university town of Oxford. A very promising beginning.
And true. It is true.
Unfortunately, he did not stay on for university there except a brief interlude at Magdalen. He chose another, and for all you British out there, the other place. Near a small river named Cam, also a place of great beauty and I'm sure equal learning. Anyway, he read English literature there, got seriously involved with plagiarism, earned a fellowship at Emmanuel's while still a graduate. Robert did write his PhD thesis at Cambridge University on plagiarism and originality in 19th century literature. It was there he started walking and writing, seriously hill walking and serious book writing. En route, he got bitten by probably several thousand midgets, numerous leeches, but no critic. Because Robert's writings on landscape, culture, memory, and the imagination proved hugely successful. Robert, the academic adventurer and roaming writer, bagged more than a dozen prestigious prizes, shortlistings, and awards along the way. It is a tremendous pleasure to have you here tonight, Robert. So we thought, as you may have gathered, this is an informal discussion evening, with a lively mixture of readings from your recent and not-so-recent books, a debate that we have, a discussion, and questions, obviously, from you. With his books, Robert hit a nerve, it seems to me. He stills a hunger that we crave for nature. And as you will find out, because we have been talking and being together for the last 3 days, it is very hard to be in Robert's company without being enthused by his insights, passion, and intellect. He is the favorite man of the hour, and I'm sure we all adore his readings, and we nod in agreement when he says we shall reconnect to nature, and we start to look through his eyes at nature. And this will be a very idyllic ecosystem of like-minded people here tonight. And it may be a bit too harmonious for me, so I will throw in one or the other provocative question to ignite a debate and maybe provoke you a little bit. But before we do that, I thought you should have the floor.
Well,
and
thank you.
Do so. He's shell-shocked, oh my God.
Well, I've never been introduced quite like that before, and I thank you very much for it. I should say to the audience that I counted as he was going through, and he managed to smuggle 5 lies in that short piece of prose. So I will leave you to decide which those untruths were. But and then thank you all for being here. younger members of the audience, particularly for coming out. Thank you so much for being here and for coming out to this extraordinary place, which I have only just begun to encounter and understand some of what is happening here, some of the complexities. But one of the reasons I was late here is that I spent this morning climbing one of your smaller peaks, the Rabenkopf, thanks to two new friends who convinced me that I should be outside for a bit as well as inside for a lot. And so we climbed the Rabenkopf and then came down, had a soft drink, of course, to 10 in the morning at Hutte, and then came down and then we swam, bathed in the Köchelsee. Kochelsee. And then we saw a Bavarian wedding in full dress. So I mean, I've done Bavaria. That's it. Climbed the mountain, swum in the lake, seen the wedding, and now, no. So I was very amazed, and I immediately said, I will bring my family back here. So to be here on this low ground, where the mountains rise, where an incredible meadow has sprung up, buzzing with life, astonishingly alive, in a transition space between low ground and high ground, intensely cultured as well. I've been hearing about the writers and artists who moved through here, who lived here, who drew inspiration from here. For me, this is as interesting as landscape gets, although every landscape is interesting. So it draws many things together. So thank you for coming. Thank you to everyone involved in bringing me to your landscape. And I am very glad to have seen a little of it, and I hope to see more of it. So we think that we might begin on the mountaintops and end underground today. So I thought we would begin with a reading from this book, Berge im Kopf, Mountains of the Mind, which it feels like another person wrote. I wrote this when I was 24 to 26. It was published when I was 27, and sometimes I meet it and it feels like a stranger's book. But I'm going to stand up here to read. Is that okay? Do I need to lift the handheld? I just speak. Good. Okay. And I want to read from the end of the book, where I do not feature as a first person. And the bit I'm going to read to you is from 1924. All of you, I think, will know the name of George Mallory, who was the British climber who died on Mount Everest in 1924. And Mallory was drawn back to Everest 3 times. He went in 1921, and he came back and he said, I'm never going again, not for all the gold in Arabia. He had a wife, he had children. He went back the next year, 1922. He came back, he said, I'll never go again, not for all the gold in Arabia. And 2 years later, he went back and he died. And this was a man who had fought in the First World War. He had tested himself against danger, the worst danger. He had seen the worst of landscape and of people. And something in the mountain, something in his heart and his mind pulled him back to that mountain 3 times. It has the structure of a fairy tale or a dark nightmare, and 3 times he returned, and on the 3rd time he died. Mallory is very important to this book because this book is about how mountains catch our hearts and draw us up them, make us fall in love with them, make us behave very strangely towards them, make us willing to die for them when they are rock and ice and air and geometry and physics and geology. So this book was an attempt to explain to myself why people climb mountains, sometimes at risk of their lives. So Mallory became important. And this reading is from the end of the 24 expedition. And they have had a really hard time. The weather has been terrible. These men were astronauts at this point. They were space travelers. No one had been above 8,000 meters apart from these men. They looked like astronauts. They had suits and they had oxygen tanks and they had special equipment. They were going up where the atmosphere stopped existing. So we need to remember them as astonishing adventurers and undertaking feats of technology and risk that were, excuse me, I'm just going to fit this slightly better. Okay, so this is the last moments of the 24 expedition, and it's already gone wrong. They shouldn't really still be trying, but they have to. Around the pale boulders and among the store boxes at base camp stride ravens, opportunists who have come to try their luck while everything is in such disarray. They tilt their heads inquisitively or hop about with both feet together like long jumpers, or sit in black-cloaked groups. Everest itself, when it is visible, is, Mallory writes to Ruth, smoking hard. The plume of ice streams out from its summit, proving the force of the wind. For a week they recoup and gather their strength at base camp. Then there is a break in the weather, and Mallory, Somervell, and Norton push back up to the North Col. But the blizzards enfold them again. The temperature drops to minus 24 Fahrenheit. They are driven back down once more to Camp 2. More porters are injured by the cold. The climbers are starting to suffer psychologically as well as physically, all of them. Even Mallory is no longer optimistic. Dear girl, he writes to Ruth, his wife, on the 27th of May. This has been a bad time altogether. I look back on tremendous efforts and exhaustions and dismal looking out of a tent door onto a world of snow and vanishing hopes. And yet, there have been many a good thing to set on the other side. He can never quite let go of it. And then, as if to reward his refusal to despair absolutely, there is a window in the weather. The wind drops, there is sunshine. This is it. Mallory writes a penultimate letter to Ruth, telling her that they will make the bid. The candle is burning out, and I must stop. Darling, I wish you the best I can, that your anxiety will be at an end before you get this, with the best news, which will also be the quickest. The col is reached and camps are set higher up the ridge. As arranged, the first proper attempt is made by the climbing pair of Somervell and Norton without oxygen. They make good progress, keeping just off the brink of the ridge, where they are out of the wind, but the terrain is more difficult. It is, writes Norton afterwards, like climbing up giant, overlapping roof tiles. There is nothing to grip onto. Everything is trying to shuck you off. Somervell has to stop, but Norton presses on to 28,000 feet before he realizes that he will die if he does not turn back. Precariously, he descends the slabs and meets Somervell. They descend together back towards the col, with Norton perhaps 20 yards ahead of Somervell. Suddenly, Somervell coughs hard, agonizingly hard, and he feels something from inside himself, some object, detach itself and jam in his throat. He begins to choke to death. He cannot breathe, nor can he shout to Norton. Norton turns, but thinks that Somervell is hanging back to make a sketch of the mountain. No, he is hanging back to die. He sits down in the snow and watches Norton walk on away from him, and then with a final effort he hammers his chest and his throat with his clenched fist simultaneously and coughs as hard as he can, and the thing dislodges itself and jumps into his mouth, and he spits it out onto the snow. It is a chunk of his larynx, killed by frostbite. Somervell and Norton descend to base camp, and Irvine and Mallory prepare to leave the North Col. On the morning of the 6th of June, they have a last breakfast of sardines, biscuits, and chocolate inside the sagging A-frame tents, and then get out onto the stamped-down snow of the col to make final preparations for the ascent. Each man has 2 big silver pods of oxygen strapped to a frame on his back. They look like early jetpack willies, as though they could just crank a lever and lift off vertically for the summit. They're wearing thick puttees, wraps around their ankles, mitts, gloves, and flying ace goggles with silver rims to protect them from snow blindness. They proceed without incident up to camps 5 and 6, and early on the 8th of June, they depart for the summit. The air is clear when they begin to climb, but within hours a fine and oddly luminous mist has begun to gather about the mountain. Noel Adele, watching from a vantage point at 26,000 feet on the mountain, sees 2 black dots moving along the summit ridge, and then the mist closes in around them. Before they leave the mountain, the surviving climbers build a pyramidal cairn of stones. Embedded in it are slates on which they scratch the names of the 12 men who have died for the mountain during the 3 expeditions. 9 of the bodies have not been recovered, but no one will forget their resting place, for it is marked by the biggest cenotaph in the world. The trek back is a grim time. The Great War is only 6 years gone, and the empty chairs, the extra elbow room at the dining table, the sense of ghosts, all of this has been well practiced by this generation. But practice makes it no less hard, no less morbid. Everyone part expects their hand on the tent flap in the middle of the night, the unexpected return from the mist. At the Mallory's home in Cambridge, on the evening of the 19th of June, a telegraph arrives, composed in the staccato heartlessness of telegraphese. Committee deeply regret receive bad news, it begins. Ruth gathers up her children and takes them into her bed and tells them. For weeks afterwards, Mallory's letters to her keep arriving. Missives from the dead. Thank you. I said to Jörg, the first reading wasn't the most humorous of the ones we would come to, so he was warned.
It was still very moving. And it immediately, because you introduced yourself with your climb or hill walk to the Rabenkopf today, immediately this contrast between a life-threatening ascent and a recreational ascent that you do before a reading came to my mind. But maybe we'll stick to the highest mountain. So if we think about Mount Everest, highest mountain of the world, then the highest mountain in Germany is the Zugspitze, which you can see from right here. Actually, it's only 9,800 feet, but still. And if I remember correctly, you wanted to climb up there. Maybe next time you're here. So it was actually first climbed by 3 audacious men in 200 years ago, in 1820. And as you may know, which is another development which I find astounding and relates immediately back to your work on nature, the first 3 men got up there by their own accord and power, physical strength. And then 100 years later, there was a meteorological observatory placed on top of the summit. Then came a luxury hotel and a cable car. And the newest cable car they just opened last year or this year, I'm not quite sure, it zips up 120 people per cabin in 10 minutes.
This is the Zugspitze.
From the bottom of the Zugspitze to the summit in 10 minutes. It's 580 people per hour and 600,000 a year. So it gets quite crowded up there. And I was just wondering how you feel about experiencing nature in splendid isolation, which makes you immerse in your surroundings, and the actual experience of nature that we as tourists do. So we waddle along in a herd or in a single file of 50 people. And it's very noisy and it's colorful. Everybody talks and chatters and so forth. So the recreational bit, the life-threatening parts of nature and also the splendid isolation, which I find in your books. And is that necessary for us to experience nature, do you think?
Okay, so lots going on there. I think the first thing is to say maybe I won't climb the Zugspitze after all.
Don't take the cable car.
You have many mountains here, and not all of them have cable cars up them and luxury hotels on the summit. So Hansi, will climb something else?
I think that actually to climb Zugspitze is quite nice. It's the summit that is terrible, but the way up to the summit is okay.
Okay, well.
Probably less crowded than the way up to Everest.
So that was exactly where I was going next. I'm often asked by people who don't know what a bad climber I am, would you climb Everest? And my first response is, no, I'm incapable of doing that. I'm very bad at altitude, and there's no way I could. The second is, I have absolutely no interest in climbing Everest. I'm fascinated by Everest. I'm fascinated by the cultural meanings we assign to landscape. That's what this book is about how over 300 years this extraordinary revolution of perception occurred concerning mountains, from, broadly speaking, indifference, dislike, fear, to worship, fascination, obsession, passion. How did that happen? How do we, within a context of at least European thought, imagination, how do we turn a landmark, a landscape, a landform 180 degrees in the way we think about it? So that is to say, I am always interested in the meanings we give and the behavior we have towards mountains. So I am as interested by the Zugspitze's tourism and Everest's queuing as I am by the impulse to be alone on a mountain. And then I would say I love the social lives of mountains. I love huts. I love the conversation that the three of us who went up Rabenkopf today had. I love walking and talking. And although one of my books, The Wild Places, is very often I'm alone, almost all of my other books are filled with people. And some of them are historical. I'm in a way in conversation with ghosts. And some of them, many of them, are just filled with the living. So I love the community that mountains create. And today we parodied Caspar David Friedrich's Traveler Above a Sea of Clouds. What's the German title of?
Wanderer über dem Nebelmeer.
Yeah, I had my hoodie on, so I did a hoodie parody of Caspar David Friedrich. So
did you take a selfie? Because that would be the 2.1 kind of Caspar David Friedrich with a selfie stick.
Well, we took a triple selfie. I don't know, is that, so the three of us together. So it was lovely to be in company. So I think I have felt all of these urges, and I suspect everyone here has felt all of these urges. To be in the mountains alone, to be in the mountains in company, to be carried up the mountains by technology, and to be carried up the mountain by the force of your own will and body.
Okay. When you say you are walking in company, either dead, i.e. historic, or living, does that mean that you read yourself into the landscape before you walk? Or which comes first, the walking or the groundwork, the briefing that every good tour does?
This is a really good question, and it's a very strange thing it's not a very strange thing, it's a mildly strange thing being a writer about landscape. Partly because everyone expects you to know the name of everything. And so if I'm out on a non-writing walk, as it were, people will say, "Oh, what's the name of that flower?" I don't know. And there's a book by David Gessner called Sick of Nature, and it begins, "I'm sick of being the nature guy on walks, the guy everyone turns to tell me what turd that the animal has produced, what the bird is in the sky." And sometimes I feel a bit sick of nature. But I think landscape is, to me, at its most interesting when it surprises me, and it always does. It sometimes surprises me through people. and the people that I meet through it. And I think of landscape as something we think with. When we are walking through a landscape, it is actively shaping our mood, our vision, our conversation, our bodies, our temperatures. It is not our backdrop, it's our medium. So I am always surprised by landscape, however much I have read up about it beforehand. But sometimes I feel I've thought my way through a place before I reach it, but then it always surprises me.
Okay. So I gather you're very kind towards your surroundings, and if one reads your books, it's all about that you're happy with everything that kind of comes towards you, living or dead, I mean stones or obstacles, whatever. And you get the feeling that you embrace everything, but I'm sure if you're walking thousands and thousands of miles in every weather, there's something that you hate about nature. And I want to write, and I want to ask a writer whose subject is nature, what do you hate about nature? What annoys you when you're out there?
I've got a long list. This is
the
great.
top three, maybe.
Yeah, the top three. Where to begin? This is brilliant. It's like Room 101 in George Orwell. Thank you for these questions. None of them I have ever been asked before, so it's very good to be thinking. I hate parasites. So my number one biological deletion is the Scottish midge. I know it will result in enormous ecosystem collapse as you remove an entire food layer from the web, food strand from the... I don't care. I just want it gone.
We have it on record, Robert. You know, so.
Yeah, this is not being live streamed, though, is it? Right? Okay. Yeah, I love the midge. No, so there's lovely stories about the Scottish midge from. This is one of these urban myths, but it may have some truth. The Scottish Tourist Board, after the Second World War, realised that the midge was going to cost Scottish tourism billions of pounds going forwards, which it does. Billions every year. I don't go to Scotland, to the Highlands, between May and September if I can help it, because I lose a pint of blood a night. Scottish Tourist Board.
Thank you for supporting
Scottish Apologies. So apparently they carried out various insecticide flyovers on a test patch, and they thought, well, we'll just really bomb this place with midge killer, and they bombed it, and then the midges. They went back to measure the midge density, and it was exactly the same. They did it again, exactly the same. They're like, how are they indestructible? They're going to survive a nuclear war. And then they got some way of observing them, and they noticed apparently that the midges, when the plane came over, all went on the underside of the leaves and stayed there until the insecticide. Smart midges. Okay. So ticks, number 2. Ticks, and we were talking about ticks today. I think ticks are a very, very, I'm going to be serious for a moment now, ticks are a very fascinating creature at the moment. I think their role in changing the way we move through landscape is now very powerful. They change the way we dress, the lotion we wear, the conversations we have, the grass through which we walk. Lyme disease is no joke. It's a brutal thing to get rid of. It's quite an increasingly easy thing to get. And their range and number have increased because, in part, of warming temperatures. So there are now areas of Britain that never had Lyme disease. It's also to do with movements of deer populations. It's to do with movements of mammalian prey and increasing numbers. I'm sure there are people here who deal with ticks in their daily life, their professional life. You? Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Yep.
Big problem.
Yes. Red zone.
Red zone. This is a red zone.
Yes.
Tell me how does it change the way, when I lay down in that wildflower meadow out there, which I did for a bit just to be in it, my second thought after I want to lie down in this wildflower meadow was, I bet there are ticks in there.
Probably further down.
Yeah.
We gargle with tick repellent before we go out there, and we just...
Serious?
Yeah, no. But we have counter measurements. Sounds like a war zone.
Red zone. Yeah. But this is interesting. This is a moment where landscape is being shaped by biology, ecology, politics, global war, in this tiny insect is really changing our relationship with pleasure and with movement. I'll stop at 2.
You stop at 2.
Actually, no. Those little hookworms that you get in the Himalayas. I got one of those when I climbed my biggest mountain, and it traveled home with me. And I only noticed it when it had written a long sentence just under my skin, all the way up my leg.
Boy.
Oh, man. 3.
Okay, right. Okay, now I'm shell-shocked. Sorry, I got a call from the Scottish Wildlife Preservation Trust here. They want to know something about the midgets. No, I was wondering, you named 3 things that you don't like, but you also have written a book about names that are beautiful because they describe beautiful creatures and they're on the verge of being extinct. And it's called The Lost Words. Would you maybe care to expand on that book project?
Yeah, I would love to. Actually, they're not in a way beautiful names or beautiful creatures, but what they are is common names and common creatures. So some time ago, a very well-known children's dictionary, which was used by many schools in Britain, issued a new edition. It only has about 1,000, I think, words in it, because it's a young children's dictionary, 5 to 7-year-olds, that kind of thing. And out of the dictionary were taken, it was noticed, about 40 words for nature. And these words, I don't know, maybe you could give the German in case there's some acorn.
Ahorn.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Bluebell.
I was with the otter, but that's the animal. Bluebell is Glockenblume.
Yeah. Bluebell.
No. The audience does not agree.
Let me hold up a...
We'll show you a picture. See, we need that
evidence.
Nature guy from your walks who can tell you.
Yeah? Bluebell?
We don't really have them in German.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
We'll watch your Twitter account. Maybe we'll get...
You learn a bit.
Yeah.
Dandelion, which I know you will have. I don't know what that is in German.
Löwenzahn.
Oh, yeah, lion's tooth.
Yeah.
Yeah, lion's tooth. Heron.
Reiher, der Vogel. Yeah.
Kingfish. This is good. It's a good
Eisvogel.
test. Eisvogel. Yes, your amazing name for the kingfisher. Icebird. Now, there's a very interesting story to Icebird. Do you know why it's called Icebird?
No.
Does anyone here know why it's called Icebird? Good. None of you can tell me I'm not telling the truth then. Do you know? So I think because when cold weather comes and hunting waters, shallow hunting waters for the kingfisher freeze over, they move to a new hunting ground. So they will follow the warmth a little bit. So they were birds that were noticed arriving in a place when the ice came, when cold weather came. So they were called icebirds because they responded to the weather. So these words fell out of the dictionary, were taken out because they weren't being used enough by children and in the language that children read. And into the dictionary came these words: blog, broadband, chat room, MP3 player. That disappeared too. And bulletin board and so on. And this story became very, very charged, as it was seen in Britain, particularly in North America as well, perhaps I think in Europe to a degree, as a moment where the gap between childhood and nature, between a very basic set of names of creatures that live in and around our lives and with our lives, was widening. It was a symptom, not a cause, but there it was. And so many cultural conversations and anxieties were expressed over this. And Jackie Morris, this extraordinary artist, and I set out to make something hopeful of it and to just make a book of just 20 words first for children, but it became something more unexpected than that. And for each word, she first of all painted the absence of that thing. So here is her beautiful painting of the absence of adder, our snake. So here there is just an outline of the adder between the plants. And then we scattered letters for the children to find, lost letters. And some of them are slightly different colors, and they spell A, D, D, E, R. So the children find them. And when they have found them and said the word, I wrote a spell. And speaking the spell brought the creature back into the mouth, into stories, into sight. This is a beautiful female adder. Jackie lives in adder country, so much so that in a terrible irony, her dog, Pi, was bitten last Monday by an adder. And after Jackie had come back from 2 weeks talking about the book and reading the adder spell, painting adders, she's going to be fine, but it looked like she would die for a while. She's a little dog. And then once you have spelt the word, seen the thing, it is back in its world with other creatures, back in its ecosystem. So it was a book of magic, really. We wanted to make a kind of impossible magic that by speaking you could bring the thing back. But it's worked. It hasn't brought the things back yet, but it seems to be going some way towards that. It's brought these words back to children, and the book has, I think there are 150,000 copies now in print in Britain. It's coming to Germany in September. It is in, I think now nearly 2/3 of schools, in every school in Scotland, Wales, and England. It's in inner city boroughs in London. These are local people raising money to give the book to schools, so every school has a copy. And they then work with those. They take the children outside, they teach them the names, they do environmental work, they build. There are now 2 lost words extensions, outdoor classrooms in schools, people making money for these. So it's been very strange, not so much to do with the book, I think, as to do with people's hopes and people's worries at the moment about nature. Can I read you a couple of spells?
Would be great, yes, please.
So I tried to write these spells in very playful language that tasted good in the mouth of a child. So they will be quite hard to follow, perhaps, but I hope you can hear not the music, but the kind of sounds of them. So I will read you Otter. Otter?
Otter.
Otter, in German. Good, okay. So this is Otter. Otter enters river without falter. What a supple slider out of halt and into water. This shape shifter's a sheer breath taker, a sure heart stopper, but you'll only ever spot a shadow flutter, bubble skein, and never, almost never, actual otter. This swift swimmer's a silver miner, with trout its oar it bores each black pool deep and deeper, delves up current steep and steeper, turns the water inside out, then inside outer. Ever dreamed of being otter? That utter underwater thunderbolter, that shimmering twister. Run to the riverbank, otter dreamer. Slip your skin and change your matter, pour your outer being into otter, and enter now as otter without falter into water. I just wanted to read 2 more spells quickly. One is Kingfisher, because we've been talking about it, Eisvogel, and it is also because it was the first spell I ever wrote when the book was beginning, and I was trying to think. Jackie said, just write with all the force of everything you love in language, and children will. She's a children's artist and illustrator. She said, don't underestimate children. Don't write down to them. Write with everything you have. So I wrote this Kingfisher spell, and and I read it to her, and I have to take quite a deep breath to see if I can get through it, because it's a bit of a tongue twister. So this is how it all began. Kingfisher. Kingfisher, the colour giver, fire bringer, flame flicker, rivers quiver. Ink black bill, orange throat, and a quick blue back gleaming feather stream. Neat and still it sits on the snag of a stick until with gold flare, wing fan, whip crack, the kingfisher, zingfisher, singfisher, flashes down too fast to follow, quick and quicker carves its hollow, in the water slings its arrow, super swift to swallow, stickleback or shrimp or minnow. Halcyon is its other name. Also ripple calmer, water nester, evening angler, weather teller, rain bringer, and rainbow bird that sets the stream alight with burn and glitter. That's Kingfisher. And then I just wanted to read one more because my friend Helen Mort is here, who is one of the best writers I know and a very dear friend of mine, and we have climbed together in the mountains in Greenland before, and we will climb together many times more, I hope. And I wrote this lark, a spell for the skylark, which is skylark?
Lerche.
Thank you. So you know you have your meadows here. I'm sure you have good skylark populations here. They go up, then that song comes down, and you stand under it, and it's like being under a waterfall of song. But in our country, their numbers are crashing, 59% down. Here too? Yes. Okay. And so they've always been this great cultural symbol of joy and hope, and they still are, but they're going. And I also wanted to write this spell about depression and about sadness and about the joy that nature brings. So this is Lark, and I wrote it mostly while I was in Greenland with Helen, so that's why I think of her when I read it. Little astronaut, where have you gone? And how is your song still torrenting on? Aren't you short of breath as you climb higher, up there in the thin air, with your magical song still tumbling on? Right now I need you, for my sadness has come again, and my heart grows flatter. So I'm coming to find you by following your song, keeping on into deep space, past dying stars and exploding suns, to where at last, little astronaut, you sing your heart out at all dark matter. That's the lark spell. Thanks.
Thank you. We were talking about it yesterday that it will be translated into German, and I'm not envious of your translator. It's going to be a hard one to do.
Yep.
But let's talk about children and declining numbers. The reading population is very stable with young children and people above 50. And the German Book Trade Association just put out some numbers yesterday about reading habits. And I think it's very interesting because Germany is one of the largest book markets in the world. And the number of readers declines rapidly. In the age bracket, our age bracket, 40 to 49, reading is down 37%. Reading books. 30 to 39-year-olds is minus 27. And people say everyday life is too busy for reading. Netflix and Prime Video, they took on the role of books because in your peer group and the public, people will debate on series that you can like and that you can get hyped on and that you have binge watching. But nobody's really talking about books in public or really larger circles. And if we look at the generations that, of course, we as Stiftung Nantesbuch, and I'm sure you as well, are very interested in, is generations Y and Z, so the ones that are in school right now, And these post-millennials grew up with internet technology, they're naturals in social media, and manage dexterously digital devices. And yet here you are, writing books, 320 tomes on, I don't know, pebbles. Sorry, I'm just going to be a bit provoking, on pebbles and paths and puffins. And I'm just wondering, are you communicating, or why are you communicating in a totally outdated and obsolete medium?
It's a fascinating representation of it. It's partly one I recognize and partly one I don't. So the bit I recognize is that when I go onto public transport, I see every single person on that machine holding a machine, and their eyes are down on that machine. I sit down, I get out my own machine, I start looking at my own machine. What's being read on that machine is text. We don't know always what that text is. Some of it is trash, some of it is news, some of it is books. I do know from 20 years nearly of interviewing students at Cambridge University that though the students are no better or worse at English literature than they were, they are much more worldly people. They know so much more now about the world. That seems to me a good thing. So I'm always keen not to trash technology, not least as I've found social media over the last year and a half an unstoppable force for good in my own experience of spreading books. So the other thing I don't recognize is in Britain we have rising book sales. So books are up. Not much, but they're up. So people are buying books. I don't have the breakdown that you have. And then to come to your question about the book as a medium. The book is a really long-lived medium. You're an art historian. You know about material culture and material objects. It's done really, really well for itself. It's done a lot better than these little plastic, metal, glass devices that we're now living with. When was Gutenberg?
400 years, 500 years ago?
Even longer. And here we are still talking about printed books. The thing, ebooks have leveled out. Why? Because people want books to hold. They still want books to hold. And this book, we were told again and again, what a ridiculous idea. You're going to publish this huge, great object? Oh no, this is absurd. It was described as a ridiculous publishing proposition. But we did it. And the reason that this book, I think one of the reasons that it has reached now hundreds of thousands of children, is because when they meet it, their faces light up. They light up partly because the sun comes off the gold on the front. They light up partly because it's so big. They enter it like a landscape in a way you don't enter a screen like a landscape. They pore over it. I have hundreds of photographs of little children sitting, pointing at this space. That's to do with the art, really, incredible art. I choose this only because I know it, but I think it weighs so much. It's so big. It won't fit on bookshelves. People say it's a coffee table book because if you put 4 legs on it, you could put your coffee on it. And so it breaks all the rules, but it also proves what books do. And I believe literature in its book form, but also in its dematerialized form, it still has this power.
We believe in books too, and I'm an avid reader, and we have a book table outside by Wordsworth. So, I was just trying to
It's a great question.
to see whether or what kind of medium that we sit here and think reading and contemplating about nature is important. What the best medium would be, and which brings me to another question, because I thought it was very interesting that you said you don't want to trash technology, and we don't either. We just kind of negotiating which content should go into which medium. And I have 2 pairs for you, as questions.
Okay.
And if you could be so kind as to say either or and not both and, makes it much more interesting an answer. And I was thinking print or handheld device, if you think of a map that you take with you on your walks, is it a
Print.
printed
Print.
weatherproof map and why, or is it a Gaia app that gives you a lot of surplus information on the landscape and GPS and all that?
Great question. When I run, when I'm doing my running, I have my measuring watch. But when I'm in the mountains, when I'm walking, if I need a map somewhere I don't know, particularly in the mountains, I carry a printed map. And people I take into the mountains, these are my friends I take up every year. I have a rule, and the rule is that we will carry GPS with us in our phones inevitably, but no one can consult it unless it is an emergency, a real emergency. And instead, we need the paper map. And the paper map is a pain. Blows around, gets wet,
Gets torn.
gets torn. But it also means that you need to be aware of where you are. You need to be following your position, not a satellite, but you, reading the landscape around you, watching the weather, moving in response as best you can. Compass bearings, what are they? They're brilliant, that's what they are, because you sight off them, you pace, you use your body to measure, not a satellite to measure. And I think these are still important things. And I know it was a big debate, and some people think nostalgic nonsense. But when your GPS breaks, or your phone battery runs out, or you find yourself in a zone of no signal, where's your map then? No, I also love maps, paper maps.
Yeah.
Beautiful documents.
So, considering that you are being bitten by midgets and scratch the bike, and then it's midgets, and it's all bloody, the map, and torn and weather beaten. Do you keep the maps as tokens? Do you have a collection of your? Do you kind of draw the path that you've been taken? Is it something that you take out, or is it just a huge pile in the bottom of your bookshelf somewhere?
You ask such good questions. Both. I have a big. One thing I do when I get a map, because I used to climb when I was a young man, and when I was much before Mountains of the Mind, I used to climb with a soldier who was a special forces soldier, and fear was a stranger to him. He didn't recognize its name, which made him a dangerous person to climb with. Fortunately, he was a bad climber. So he would always send me first to lead, and then he would stand behind me saying, "Come on, it's not that bad. Come on, get up there."
Boot camp.
He always said whenever he got a map in our country, they're folded around and they have a hard cover, like a card cover.
Standard.
He would just rip it off. So then you don't have to be dealing with folding cards. So then he would just have the paper. And then he would slot it back in to file it afterwards. So I always rip them off straight away. But the National Museum of Scotland is building up a collection of mountaineering culture, particularly to do with the Cairngorms, which is an area I've written a great deal about. And so they have just acquired a bunch of my objects. I know. I said, why do you want a bunch of my objects? But anyway, they wanted a bunch of my objects. So they have my grandfather's skis. So these are old wooden skis that he covered many thousands of miles in the Alps in Scotland. And they're, 2 meter tall wooden skis, very heavy. And poles with buckets, rattan leather buckets, which I've skied with. My compass is going. So I need a new compass. And my map of the Cairngorms is going with all my notes, my tracings, my bearings for boxing. Do you know boxing out a corrie? So if you're in a whiteout,
are you triangulating there?
You're trying to skirt around a dangerous area. So instead of hugging the line of the cliffs, which in winter you can't tell where that is, you box it out. So you take a bearing inland of the cliff, then parallel to the cliff, then back. So you're never close to. So it has a lot of my boxing out marks on it. So yeah, I love these documents. GPS doesn't have it.
Right. So you will have lots of museum visitors going into the wild and retracing your steps in nature.
No, I think it's going
pilgrimage
to
of
get
Macfarlane.
dusty in an archive somewhere, but that's where it's going next month.
Okay. So if one of the two pairs is printed or digital, the other one I would like to ask you, and maybe lead on to your third reading, would be doing thousands of miles on foot. Would it be path-bound or cross-country? What's your preference?
I can't have both, can I? No. I think path-bound.
One after the other, maybe.
I think path-bound over cross-country, just
Why is that?
because in the end, moving cross-country paths are there because they know the best way through the landscape. They contour, they are accumulations of knowledge and decision-making. I love the fact that a path cannot really be made by one person. Or if it is made by one person, it's by one person doing repeated action. But generally paths are very communal makings. And so they gather all of these little decisions people make. You probably have a version of this. Do you call them elephant paths? Desire lines. So someone's nodding. Is this elephant path in German? I know in Dutch it's an Trampel. Yes, yeah. So in cities where they peel off and Trampel. Pfad. Yeah. Okay. So these are fascinating, as everyone knows, fascinating expressions of desire and gathered dissent against where the authorities want you to go. So path. Yeah.
Right. Would you like to read something from the...
Yeah, I would. Although the bit I'd chosen was off path.
We get the full picture.
No,
then.
we're off and then on. Okay, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
So I wrote this long book. It was the longest book I'd written. I vowed never to write a longer book, but I broke that vow just now, recently. So this is about paths, and it's about what I call habits of a landscape. So I walked more than 1,000 miles across many countries, including the occupied territories of Palestine and the West Bank and Spain, parts of the Camino, Scotland, and in the Sichuanese mountains. They're not technically the Himalayas, but they're the sort of east. They look like the easternmost part of the Himalayas if you look on a map. And there I was interested in sacred landscapes. Your landscapes are sacred. They have crosses on the summits. Those of you who have been to the Himalayas will know that there are prayer flags, there are Mani stones, there are prayer wheels, there are monasteries. It's a very intensely devotional landscape around the big mountains in particular. So I went on a long winter expedition to a mountain called Minyakonka, which is a very holy and very beautiful and very high and very deadly mountain. Sorry, there's a little bit of crackle when I move my head. I'm sorry about that. So we've just left a high camp. And it's winter, it's very cold at night, it's -20. There's 3 of us and a horse. Horse bells, the crunch of feet, my own ragged breathing, pedestrian life at 5,000 meters. Pace after pace, patiently, exhaustingly following the bare trace of a path. The world dwindled to the next step, then opened out at an upwards glance. The sun gold in the sky, hard snow, high albedo. We'd left Jatso's house early as 2 ravens wandered the blue air above the stockade. We crossed a river by an unsteady wooden bridge, the water frozen at the river's margins, flowing deep and green in the center. up through a trackless rising valley, scrubbed, trackless, with juniper, with vultures wheeling overhead, and unclimbed peaks lining the northern sky. The snow over which we passed bore the slot marks of ungulates, as well as fox fonts and the scat of unknown creatures. Bird feet printed it like tiny arrows or route markers. This way, this way. 4 hours' work brought us to a pass, and there before us, 2 miles away and nearly 2 miles up, was Minyakonka, far closer than I had expected. Darshan is a Sanskrit word that an expression of an encounter with the holy. Darshan, a hierophany, but I'd been taught it. We'd been talking about this word. Darshan, it really was, to see this mountain floating there. I sat down in the snow under a rope of weathered prayer flags, gulping for breath. And from there it was down, steeply down, across shale slopes, the stones of the path flowing in the sunlight, the horses skidding on their front hooves, breaking with their back hooves, deerskin bags lurching forwards on their flanks, their bells tolling rapid alarm. We came on behind, tracing a stream cut as it plunged off the pass, following it between saplings of pine and oak and through bushes of rhododendron, stumbling in powder snow that reached knee-deep in places. The stream was part frozen, halted mid-leap in elaborate forms of yearning, chandeliers and ink flicks and hat feathers. A small bright bird flew to a gnarled pine. We rested in a clearing. I sat with my back against the warm wall, facing the sun and the mountain, narrowing my eyes. And then we camp in this very distant place. And it was in a steep-sided valley with the mountain above us. So mostly it was in shadow. And so where a little stream ran off the side of the gorge far above us, the icicles were the biggest I've ever seen. Bigger than this, the depth of this room. They hung like weapons way above us. Of the nights I spent out while following my paths, that one was by far the coldest. At its lowest it reached below -20, a dry cold, but a cold that stole to the bone. None of us really slept except for Jatso, with whom I shared a tent, and who snored inspiringly from beneath a heap of blankets for 10 hours. At one point I crawled out of the tent to try and shake warmth back into my limbs. The sky was framed by the black valley sides. There was a shooting star, and then a satellite, winking across the darkness. A grey-gold flutter of light from the fire. A curd yellow moon. Old land, high crags, silence, the moon, the fire, and a feeling of deep calm and connection. So it was so cold that when I came out the next morning, I tried to pull my sleeping bag out. And normally your sleeping bag comes out like this, but this one came out as a single solid object. And I picked it up, and I leaned it up against a tree. And then I got my socks out, and they were also solid objects. So I put them near the fire to thaw them out before I could get into them. And then I could tell it was really cold because Jatso, who was the local guy whose horses we were with, who was from this very high up valley, wonderful man, he got the fuel bottle, and the fuel was diesel, and it had turned to jelly inside. And I just remember the fire was going, and he just walked up to the fire with the diesel canister, and he just chucked it in the fire. But no, he was just warming it up. He was melting the diesel inside the canister, and when he was ready, just hooked it out, and then we got some water boiling. So, yeah, okay.
Thank you. I just got hooked by a word that did not belong in the scene, which was the chandelier that you used, obviously an artistic and allegory for the sparkling waters, the Kronleuchter. which comes out of the everyday urban environment. And I've been thinking about naming.
Yeah.
So if we can just come to that again, because you said names in nature are that we need them to connect to nature and to let it into our lives, because something we can name, we deal with it, and in the best sense, we could probably care for it. Because if we don't have a name for it, it doesn't exist in our life. Now, it's all focused on nature, but I've been thinking, as a not been born in a village, but in the big city of Berlin. So my context is urban, and we actually, a lot of cities and people who live in them name sites after nature. So in London, for example, there's the Sir Norman Foster Gherkin in the financial district, which is this kind of coned, well, there are words as well, but there you go. It's this coned 41-story high object.
It has other nicknames as well.
I know.
Yeah.
We are live, so
Yeah.
and it's too early. But anyway, and if we hop from capital to capital, if we go to Berlin, then there's this international conference hall for the international arts, and it has very kind of sweeping forms, 1958 or 7 built, and a protruding concert hall above a reflecting pool, and it's called the Pregnant Oyster. It's an industrial thing, but it's a pregnant oyster. And here actually in Munich, the Oktoberfest, which is fun and bling bling and all the rest of it, it's called Wiesen, which is meadow. So I'm just thinking your thoughts on urban folks like me, kind of taking nature into the city. What does that tell you about naming?
It's a brilliant question. I'm not going to stop saying that, because they're all brilliant questions. They're really making me think. I have 2 things to say to that. One is a good thing, or one is a positive thing, and one is a critical thing. The good thing is this: our cities are, in many cases, biodiversity centres. In Britain, in many ways, the countryside is now barren, is now desert. This is where the rapid declines of species and biodiversity numbers has happened. Our countryside is heavily farmed, and sometimes it's farmed well, and sometimes it's farmed badly, and this is a question we are now engaging with the opportunity, as well as the dreadful kind of costs of Brexit. How do we remake a farming system for ourselves now? What do we do with our subsidies? But in many ways, it's a factory floor, a huge, green, flat factory floor. And like all factory floors, it has to be kept clean of trouble. And so it is, by chemicals and by other means. So in many ways, nature has fallen back to the cities. So I'm always keen to uncouple the idea that nature is the country and city is denatured. They're not. Berlin, Munich, these are richly species cities. Prague has, I think, an 8,000 species count. It's an incredible place. I spent a lot of time there with a biodiversity expert. The numbers are in Underland exactly about that. There's a peregrine that I see every day, a peregrine falcon. Most glorious birds that lifts my heart every time I see it. I can't say exactly where it nests in Cambridge, but it nests in a very, very central position above one of the busiest streets, because the Gothic architecture of Cambridge is a beautiful cliff face to a peregrine. So, these are great things. So nature should be in our cities. Nature names in our cities is a slightly different matter. I would love it if we renamed one of our medieval streets Peregrine Falcon Close.
Causeway or
Yeah, but when I have problems is when developers use the pastoral. So the pastoral is a means of disguise and deceit. It's a means of selling a dream of green, even as you're destroying the reality of green. So of course you call your new close woodland close, or you call it flower meadow close, even if there's nothing close to flower meadows in your close. Or you call it wildwood close. Really? No. And by doing so, you can maybe add a few more pounds to your property price. So I'm not saying all developers work in bad faith, but many of them clearly biodiversity and habitat loss is very low down their list of priorities. And they mitigate that through naming, but with the only intent being a profit maximization.
I do understand the real estate reservations, but I'm just thinking of another layer or another thesis to throw into the discussion would be that it is something that we cannot relate to because it looks odd or it's even ugly, the structure of the building.
Okay.
And just by that, we'll try to make it sympathetic for us. So we'll take something that is at our hands in our lives, like a vegetable or, well, an oyster wouldn't be, but still, it sticks to your mind. And we'll make it sympathetic by naming it. And then we can connect to it in a more optimistic way. But of course, if I'm a real estate agent and it's a concrete obscenity, and I'll name it very romantically, then
I feel I'm learning a lot about your psyche, although we've only just met. In that you find gherkins sympathetic, and they bring out optimism in you. There were lots earlier downstairs. I can see you invest heavily.
Oh well, there
in
it
the
is
gherkin.
on record now.
Well, they become characters on the skyline. That is true, but they already are. So the other names for some of the skyscrapers in London are the walkie-talkie building, the cheese grater. These are not, I mean, maybe you find them sympathetic or life-enhancing or art-melting, I don't know. But actually, one of them, I think it was the walkie-talkie building, which is a skyscraper that goes up and curves out and over and has a little bit of a bend to it as well. It wasn't foreseen that by creating effectively a reflective mirror that would focus heat. It was made of glass. Some of you may have heard this story. Again, has slightly the status of urban myth, but I think is true. On very hot days, it was found to concentrate heat down at street level to the degree that it began to melt the rubber on cars. And this seemed like this amazing metaphor for these great soaring edifices of money and steel made to rise from the city and lean over the city, financial district, and then focused all their rage down and melted the everyday person's car.
I think the architect is looking for a new job now because he lost his license
Lost his
to
BMW, yeah.
Right, but although walkie-talkie is not a thing that you find in nature, whereas gherkin, oysters, meadows, and so forth are all kind of coming from the rural area. I was just wondering, Robert, should we open the floor to a few questions from the audience, and then maybe as a final, or would you?
No.
Like
I don't want to stop talking. You've heard lots from me. I'd much rather hear from you or
and
answer
then
questions.
maybe
so.
because we still have to live up to your
the up to down.
down.
Okay.
That maybe as a final
maybe
moment you can at the end read from Underland.
a short bit. Yeah, that's a really good idea. Yeah.
But
So-
maybe we can take questions from you.
or
And if you
thoughts, stories, your own stories as well.
if you don't feel comfortable putting them out in English, we're most happy to translate and make it an international debate.
You have a
Obviously
have a
been in-
microphone coming.
Yes. Sorry. Wondered who was behind me. Margaret Schmidt. I am
Margaret.
British, but also German now.
Welcome.
Thanks to Brexit.
Oh my word!
I'm very intrigued that you've obviously been installed with this love and passion for nature. Was it your parents, or did you come to this love of the world around you, or did you come to it later on in life as a teenager? Or was it right from the start installed in you? Respect, admiration, and love.
Thank you for the question. My mother is very fond of reminding me that I refused to take the dog for a walk when I was growing up. I was very reluctant to take the dog for a walk. I grew up at the end of a country lane I traveled 15 miles or so early every morning to school and back on the bus in the city centre. So I didn't know it then, but I grew up in Nottinghamshire, in a sort of lush, hard-working. It was like mining country. It was farming country, and my father was a respiratory physician who treated the miners who had breathing problems, silicosis. So the landscape was labouring and hard-working, but it was also quite kind of rural. So I did spend a lot of time out in that, though oddly that is the one, I've realised that though I lived in it for 15 years, I've written nothing about Nottinghamshire ever. And I wrote a few pages about it in Underland, and then I cut them. So something is happening there. I don't know quite why, but then the mountains were very part of our lives from a very early days. So this reference will be lost on a German audience, but we had Mr. Kipling's cakes. Maybe it won't be lost on a German audience. So these were little cakes that you had cherry bakewells and almond slices. And so some of my young birthdays, we would go up onto a windy, wet hill somewhere in Connemara or Scotland, and we would have a little cherry bakewell with a single candle in it that kept getting blown out by the wind and the rain. So it was always about going out and being out. And I had a very loving, I still have very loving, wonderful parents. My mother in particular is just still amazed at the world. It's quite hard to be amazed at the world. Perhaps as you get near 70, I already find it hard to be amazed by the world, but she is still amazed by the world. So John Muir, the naturalist and traveller and writer, who's the father of American national parks in many ways, I remember him saying, about his Californian days when he was young, he said, I lived in a perpetual storm of wonder. It's very tiring, but he did, and Mum is very good at that. That storm is still very strong for her. So yeah, parents were very strong, and then books. So I think being out and reading in. Thank you.
I haven't read all of your books, so maybe this question is answered already in one of your books, but I wanted to know if you have climbed Mount Sinai. And if so, if you can also tell us something about the relationship between climbing and holiness. And the purgatory is very often described as a mountain which people climb. So how the relation is between these two dimensions?
That is such an interesting question. And religion we've been having this 3-day seminar on nature, writing and landscape. And I said to someone yesterday, I really want to talk about religion. It hasn't come up. It's a sort of fear of allowing theology into this conversation. I haven't climbed Mount Sinai. I do not follow a faith myself, but I'm not a materialist. And I am fascinated by devotion, religious attachment, and spiritual attachment to landscape. And I've written a lot about it, from Neolithic ritual landscapes to contemporary devotional landscapes such as I described in the Himalayas. I suppose, and I reminded when you did the spiral of one of John Donne's sermons where he says, truth stands on a hill. Truth stands ragged on a high hill, and he that would reach her about must go. And clearly this allegorical ascent, the hard work to the high point, is just as fundamental to the experience of climbing. But I will complete this necessarily inadequate answer by pointing downwards, and say that, of course, the inverse is the descent to hell and to the underworld. And that's what I've spent 6 years thinking about, is about the ways in which we think of the underworld, the underland, as the place we put the things we love the most, and the place we put the things we fear the most. And all of myth, I have yet to meet a culture that doesn't have an underworld, and I have yet to meet a culture where there is not some story of the descent into the realm of the inferno via the purgatory, the classical rivers of Acheron, Styx, Leith, which lead downwards into this space. So I am fascinated by how really mythology and geology are two different stories for explaining these. Can I ask you a question back? Yes. This is something that fascinates you, interests you?
I've climbed myself Mount Sinai, and I just did it as a tourist because I was there and everyone was doing it, so let's do it. And it was at night because it's so hot, so people would start very, very, early in the morning or at night and be up. And I was just, it was a very social moment. You mentioned it before because there are really masses of people there, from all the different religions.
Yeah.
I didn't do the climbing as a believer. I did it as a tourist, but I ended up fascinated by the meaning which has this climbing. And I thought, even if I didn't want, be part of that religious enthusiasm, I just, watched around me because there are really very, very even old people climbing over there, sick people, and I was myself very, very much fatigued, and I thought, my God, how can these people go up and feel so well? But they did. And then I experienced myself just climbing as a form of purification. It was nothing that I was thinking before, or that people told me you have to do it in order to
be purified.
It was just something which happened, and that's, I don't know, I suppose it's the physical effort, it's the way you do the way landscapes changes you. I cannot explain that, but obviously you know that monks and people like to be in these landscapes where you have this experiences of solitude, of self reflection and all that. I think it has to do with that.
But it's also, as you say, a community act often. So that makes me think very briefly of, I've written about it in the Wild Places, of climbing Croagh Patrick, which is a mountain in the west of Ireland. And on Roke Sunday in the summer, many, many pilgrims climb it, but they climb it barefoot. And the geology leaves many sharp stones. It's like climbing on little needles and triangles, pyramids. And many people's feet are bleeding heavily by the time they reach the summit. And these are people from all classes, backgrounds, Catholic pilgrims, who come and they climb up this. They don't climb mountains normally, but that day and the following Sunday, I climbed it that day with them, and I climbed some of it barefoot. And I just watched these people with these bleeding feet coming up the mountain to the summit. And it was cold up there as well. It's incredible.
Another thing is, for instance, in Rome, you have the Holy Stair, so you see people have to climb it with their knees.
Yeah.
I think it is, of course, in this experience of, being stronger than body and than pain, that gives you a new dimension in that experience, which is something which is so far from our everyday society. This, enjoying pain somehow. So this might be one explanation.
Thank you very much. Yes, Gero, do you want a microphone?
How important is it for you to get to the top of the mountain?
So
Stop short of the top.
the question was, how important is it for me to get to the top of the mountain? So Gero was with me on Rabenkopf today and saw how happy I was on the top. But I think you saw how happy I was all the way up. and all the way down again as well. So, no, I used to be a summit bagger, as we call them in England, Munro bagger, and I still love being on the tops of mountains because you are. I think the line in Mountains of the Mind, which is probably the line I've written that's most quoted of any line, I said, those who climb to mountain tops are half in love with themselves and half in love with oblivion. And I think it's that moment when you reach a mountain top and you are exalted, but also destroyed by the space and the time that opens around you. So I think it would be precious of me, like cute, to stop 10 meters short of a summit and say, oh no, I'm not going to the summit because I'm such a pilgrim. But I am not unhappy in a day where I cross a pass and come down the other side of a group of mountains or over a shoulder or don't go up a top that we intended to go up. It doesn't bother me at all.
Is it a male thing?
Yeah.
We're talking about this
Yeah.
today, so I guess you get...
Is it a male thing? Well, broadly speaking, I think yes. I think the wish to conquer, and you see it in the language of 19th and 20th century mountaineering narratives in Europe. And Helen Mort has written a beautiful book of poems called No Map Can Show Them, No Map Could Show Them, which is about the way women mountaineers and their ways of seeing and moving are almost written out of many 19th and 20th century mountaineering stories. So, yeah, I think men love to dominate. They lay siege to the mountain. The language of the Everest attempts is one of war, and it's one of kind of assault and defeat and murder, and also of virginity taking. So I really find that a problematic discourse. And I would prefer to the love and what Nan Shepherd calls the traffic of love, which can be a very funny thing and a lively thing as well. So thanks for the question.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
You talked about landscapes and where you grew up. How do you think it left an imprint on you and where you live now, or is it the same city? And all the traveling, how where you grew up influenced, and that landscape influenced you on feeling at home where you live now, and you're not obviously living on some mountain?
No, far from it. I live in a suburb on the edge of a city, and I'm very happy there.
In Woodhill Street.
Sorry?
By a real estate agent.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, in Wildwood Street. No, not quite. But no, I live right on the edge of a city now, where just within a few hundred meters of where the fields start and the hedges start and the pesticides start. But I live in the flattest part of Europe, apart from the Netherlands. I live in the fenlands of Cambridgeshire, which is a very strange place to end up as a mountain lover. But yeah, we have tall buildings. So when I was a student, I went through a period of, we call it buildering, climbing buildings in the darkness, with or without ropes. Cambridge is good for buildering, but I'm kept there by my students, who I adore, and by teaching, which is what I do and what I am fortunate to do. The home landscape, the one I grew up in, it's strange. I haven't explained to myself why I haven't written about it. In an odd way, Underland comes out of it, because I lived in a landscape that was, mining country, and it is around here too, coal mining.
Pitch coal mining.
Pitch coal.
Yeah.
Is that tunnel mining rather than open mining?
Yep.
So I knew that there was this world going on, this world of risk and labor and industry everywhere around under me. I was very lucky not to be in it. And I became good friends with a miner called Peter Smith. And he was the best whistler I have ever met. He could do bird song and national anthems, and he could do two-tone whistling And he was also the happiest man I think I've ever known. And when I said to him, "Why are you so happy, Peter?" He just said, "Because I'm not down the mine. Every day I give thanks I'm in the sun." He taught me how to play golf, and he taught me how to gamble on golf as well. He was great, and still
Now we
is.
learned something about your psyche as well.
Yeah. Jose Maria Alathabal won me my first bet when he won the Augusta Masters. I love that man. That was a Peter Smith tip. So, so I think in an odd way, trying to work out about D.H. Lawrence went to my school and wrote these stories about Nottinghamshire. He found it a hard place. He wrote strangely, but he wrote this great story, Odour of Chrysanthemums, about a mining accident, which was the first thing I studied when I was at school. So I think a feeling that I didn't know this world of work and mining, but that it was part of where I grew up. So if it's played out, it's probably there. Thanks for a really interesting question.
Since we are venturing towards the underland, and before you read your last bit, we can discuss further questions when we have a glass of wine, and I hope the online world is getting something to drink as well in a minute. Stay tuned for the last stretch. I was just wondering, before we follow you underground, I was wondering whether you could tell us something about the little pin you're wearing on your coat, because it seems to me that it's a fly accurate, and I was just wondering what it may stand for.
Yes, probably the most recognizable toadstool in the world. This is the fly agaric, Muscaria amanita, I think, and it is my pin badge of shame. And it was given to me by Jackie Morris, the artist with whom I made the Lost Words. And it was to remind me that I very much do not know the name of everything, because about 10 years ago I was walking through some lovely pine forest with my children. I didn't have my glasses on. And I said, "Children, stop! Look! There is the fairy tale toadstool. There is the fly agaric. It's poisonous. It's mythic. It's wonderful. Leprechauns live on it. Goblins live in it. Vikings were hallucinated on it before they went into combat. Come, let us see it." I exaggerate slightly, but I was really excited. And we walked a little bit closer, and it turned out to be a slice of watermelon that some hiker had left at the base of a tree. So whenever I say to them, "What's that name of that tree?" they're just like, "Watermelon," or "Fly agaric." So Jackie was like, "Wear the pin badge of shame and never take it off." So that's the pin badge of shame. Do we have time for me? Do we really have time for me to read something else?
From Underland, yes, please do.
Okay, I know you have places to get to. I've never read this before. I was going to read something longer, but I'm not going to now. So I'll just read a short bit. And so this is up on the Lofoten Islands in the Arctic, near the Arctic in Norway, and in a cave there called Kolhelaren, which means Hell's Mouth. It's very hard to get to. You have to cross a series of mountains in winter, in my case, that are difficult. And I was over there for several days without reception and in conditions that became very difficult, very challenging. But up there is a rare example of Arctic latitude painted cave art. And there's not much up there because it was cold, there weren't so many people up there. It's not limestone, so you don't get good caves for making cave art, and it rains a lot. So it tends to, the moisture content tends to be hostile to paint. But there is this cave which has these red dancing figures painted on the wall, probably sometime in what we call the Bronze Age. And even to get to this cave for them would have been an incredible crossing of thresholds on foot or by water. And it's set right by the whirlpool that is called the Maelstrom, the true Maelstrom that gives the name of Maelstrom to everything. And all I will say is that I've passed through some very, very difficult challenges that I was not expecting and that really troubled me to reach the place. And so much has happened, and I've been so focused on getting to this place. And then I enter this incredible cave, sea eagles overhead, otters, nothing, fury of weather, 150-foot high cave, looking for these figures. That's become part of the underworld journeys, into the darkness to look for figures. On and down the main rift, the light's still rich here, but the colors already falling away. Pupils widening. 100 feet in, the cave becomes cross-like in its architecture. 2 side rifts cut away to left and right, separated by a vast white bastion of stone against which the space breaks into 3. I place a hand flat on the bastion and feel the cold of the stone rush fast, petrifying up the arm. The air in here thrums, sounded by sea and wind driven into this hollow, so it turns upon itself. I take the left-hand rift rising up and into the mountain. Old rockfall lies above, shattered on the rift floor. There's yellow-white granite to the right-hand side. Leaning away and leaning over now is a darker stone, streaked with red and black. A teardrop shape of clear light is visible back at the bastion. I'm here, at last. Such a long, hard journey to reach this place. I sit on cold rock, let my eyes adjust to the shadow, looking at the leaning wall of stone. But there are no figures on the stone. None at all. I look again, I stare, I search, nothing emerges. There's nothing there. I've come all this way, all of these miles, that gully, and the figures have vanished. Were they ever here at all? I lean back, right back against the rock behind, let the stone take my weight, let the darkness settle into my eyes that are tired of looking. And when I open my eyes and look again, there is, yes, there, and there's the flicker of a line that is not of the rock's making. And that line is crossed by another and joined by a third, and there is a dancer, scarcely visible, but unmistakable now, a ghostly red dancer leaping in the rock. And there is another and another there, a dozen or more of these dancers, spectral but still present, leaping and dancing on the rock, their arms outstretched and their legs wide, their forms shifting and tensing as I blink. The red of them is rough at its edges, fading back into the rock that made it, blurred by water and condensation and exhaustion. And that is what gives the figures their life, I see. It makes them shift, shapes on this volatile canvas in which shadow and water and rock and fatigue are all artists together. And for once the old notion of ghosts suddenly seems new and true in this space. These figures are ghosts, all dancing together, and I am a ghost to them too. And there is a conviviality to this ghostliness, to us, to the thousands of years for which they have been dancing here together, and the dance that I have just joined. And then suddenly and unexpectedly my head begins to tingle, and then my back and my chest begin to shake, and I find myself crying. Huge sobs overtaking my body, crying there in the darkness, very far from any other human, very close to these generous figures. And the dangers of the journey to reach the dancers ebb from me, and the joy of their movement ebbs into me, and I cry there, very surprised and helpless, deep in the granite and deep in the darkness for feelings I cannot name. And later I think of the haunting image of the Sami underland as a perfect inversion of the human realm, with the surface of the earth always its mirror line, so that the feet of the dead who must walk upside down touch those of the living who stand upright. And I lay a hand on the rock behind me, not the rock of the figures, but the unpainted rock of the opposite wall. And there is a hand of stone pressing through from within the rock to meet mine, palm to palm and finger to finger. The sea eagle turns by the cliff. The waves crash on the boulders below the cave. The maelstrom gyres and ungyres. Time proceeds according to its usual rhythms beyond the threshold. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Thanks for listening to that. It's really lovely to give voice to work that no one has ever heard before, apart from my head for the last 6 years. So that's really, thanks.
Well, thank you for the premiere, and thank you so much for being here tonight. And I hope that we may find time in the future to discuss here at Nantesbuch with you issues above ground, below ground, our future in and with nature. So maybe connecting to your last reading, it is good custom here to give our guests a little farewell present.
You got me worried now, after the way you began.
And I'm not really comfortable in giving a man flowers, so I refrained from that. So our second idea was to give you Nantesbuch honey, because we have quite a lot of bees, but then we thought, well, you will eat this and then it'll be gone. So we thought you have to remember us by something more permanent and durable. And so, wow! We, because if you've been reading Underland, we will give you a piece of molasse conglomerate, actually from the hill that we are sitting on at this very moment. And since it's quite unruly and heavy and got a shape and mind of its own, kind of like us, we need a wrapping. You know, every good present needs a wrapping, and well, this is so much fun. The thing is that the wrapping that I'm going to put it in may just be one of your next words of the day, a tremendous series that you put out on Twitter, hunting for local terminology. And this is just a napkin we use today. And we wrap it as a pschort. Now the spelling I'll give you later on, it's B-S-C-H-O-A-D, pschort. And usually it is used to wrap up food, leftover food from a feast. And I'll just tie it while I continue speaking with you, north to south and east to west, with 2 knots. And you would carry home the leftovers from a feast, and I think this will be the leftover from a tremendous intellectual feast on nature with you. So here it is in a traditional Bavarian pschort, the leftover molasse conglomerate from Nantesbuch.
This is the best
Thank you so much
present I've ever had for a reading. Thank you so much. Thank you, that is wonderful. Thank you all very, very much.
And thank you very much for all of you for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. Brilliant audience, thank you. Very touched by this.